Arguments and conflict are part of having a relationship. But sometimes when you have a conflict with your officer, you notice something shifts. They get a little puffy. Maybe as an officer, you look back on a conflict and think, why did I react that way? Today, we are talking about how another skill that keeps officers and first responders safe on the job spills over at home. Stay tuned. You're listening to the Code for Couples podcast.
Welcome to the Code for Couples podcast, focusing on topics for law enforcement officers and couples to keep you and your relationship connected, resilient, and code for. Now, your host, law enforcement expert Cindy Doyle, author of Hold the Line and My Wife.
Welcome back to the Code for Couples podcast. I am your host, Cindy Doyle. First, I want to give a quick shout out to Responder Life in Oregon. They help to equip first responders in the Pacific Northwest to care for themselves, their families, and their neighbors. They organized and hosted the Northwest Peer Support Conference this past week in Salem, Oregon. And it was great to connect and meet so many people that are committed to first responder mental health. I was honored for them to bring me out to teach a pre-conference workshop to clinicians and then to keynote the conference the following day. It was just such an honor for me to be there with y'all and to speak with you. I love talking about how to protect our relationships and mental health of first responders. Y'all are such a great organization. I just want to give you a shout out. So thank you, Responder Life. If you want to check them out, if you're in that region, you can go to responderlife.org. They have a lot of great resources on their website, and they offer a lot of peer support training out there. All right. Now, on to what I always wanted to talk about in regard to conflict. I know I am not unique in this. How many times have you maybe looked at your officer and said, I'm not one of your citizens? That was what I would do from time to time, and I haven't had to do it lately, but there used to be times where he would look at me and give me this glare. He has a way of glaring at me and like looking right through me. And I've seen him do it, but it's not normally to me. It's usually when he's trying to get control of a situation on a job. And when it's used on me, it really pisses me off. He later apologizes and tells me that like it just kicks in and it's not something he wanted to do or wants to do in that moment, but it just came up. And so me saying, I'm not one of your citizens was a common phrase that I used to use. So occasionally we have these experiences in our relationship and I just kind of store them away. Then going along in my days of trying to figure out what's going on in my relationship with my husband and how it's unique. And I come across this article about authoritarian spillover and how it impacts first responder and law enforcement relationships. And I am just totally blown away when I read this article and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is what's happening. So let me start with kind of explaining what authoritarian spillover is. Officers and first responders rely on something called command presence on the job. And really, command presence is, kind of what it says, right? They're commanding a presence, right? I'm going to get control of a scene. So it means that they're projecting like authority and confidence and decisiveness to ensure control and safety on a scene in a high pressure situation. And it's critical for survival. So think about if they're on a highway and they're trying to get people to go, or there's a crowd around something happening, or a crowd's in danger and they're trying to like get control of a situation. So it's a way for an officer or first responder to get control of a scene. And what do they do in order to get control of a scene? Think about it. Their whole body starts commanding respect and authority. And the first thing they do, and maybe even as a parent, because this isn't unique to like just this career. So as a parent, you might do this too. I always think of officers growing like 6 inches. It's like, and then their shoulders roll back and they start to point. They use really short language and they glare, but they're in control. And this is something that's trained into their brain. It's training in order to get that command presence or that authority of a scene. They don't think about it, they just do it, and that's good. Once again, another skill that we want them to have because they come home to us at home, but guess what? It comes home too. So fast forward to home, the brain is now trained to do this behavior when a situation gets out of control. When things are out of control, people die. So the brain kicks this on at inopportune times, like in traffic jams, or when the kids are chaotic, or when you're in a disagreement. It just decides to kick on anytime it feels like things are out of control. And so I need to get control because I don't want people to die. At home, going into command presence doesn't help. That same approach to the family, to spouses, feels like micromanagement and control. So, for an example, an officer might say, do this, or try to solve a problem instead of listening. And so it makes loved ones feel dismissed, undervalued, or like I said, control. So, as spouses and family, we wind up usually reacting to being bossed around, and we either shut down or we can escalate a situation. And so it just kind of makes it worse. I was talking about this one time on another podcast. I was being interviewed, and the host, who was an officer, started laughing all of a sudden. And I was so confused. I thought, what did I say? It was funny. And I just paused and he says, "Oh my gosh, I did this to my wife this weekend. We were on a family trip. The kids were getting crazy. And all of a sudden, I pulled the car over and I looked at my wife and I said, 'You out of the car now.'" And he was pointing as he was doing the interview. And he's like, "Oh my gosh, I think I do this all the time." And so many times as families or spouses, we're conditioned to just accept that behavior or to know that that's happening. And if somebody says, "You get out of the car," most of the time our body is gonna be like, "Oh, fight or flight. This is a little scary." We can become conditioned by it just like officers are conditioned to get control. It's not intentional. We wanna be very clear about that this behavior is not intentional. It turns on. Officers are trained to quickly assess situations, take charge, minimize risks, but this conditioning doesn't automatically switch off when they come home because it's a habit. It's something they do day in and day out. And so it's in their brain and they're wired now for it. The key to overcoming this is awareness and a shift in the communication instead of defaulting to that command mode. Awareness is really the first step. Officers need to be aware of how this starts to show up in their body. Do you get flush? Do you start to get agitated or anxious? Do you start thinking these people are driving me crazy? They need to be disciplined. This is out of control. Start being aware of what it shows up like in your body. Spouses, you need to be aware of this as well. What does it look like when your officer's command presence or authoritarian spillover starts to turn on? Do you see them puffing up? Do you start to my bless my husband's heart. He's got this little vein and it's like when it starts to go, I'm like, "Oh, the vein's going." So, little things like that. How can you be aware of when it's starting to turn on and keep in mind that this is what's happening? It can turn on suddenly and you're all of a sudden you're like, "What the heck is going on?" But if you know that this is there, then you're less likely to take it personally. So, step 1, awareness. Next, as a couple, I'm going to recommend that once you know it's there and it's showing up, that you find a word to let your officer or to communicate that it's kicking in. A word that we agreed upon, or the phrase we agreed upon, was stand down. But I used to say things like stand down and like yell. Don't do that. Not good. But if I look at him and I say, "Hey, stand down," in a firm, gentle tone, and I just look at him, when I say that to him now, he realizes he needs to back off and take a breath. And he'll be really quiet, and it won't be like in the moment where he's like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, honey." No, he has to go power down. And so all he does is it clicks, and then he just turns and walks away. Now he'll come back, but don't necessarily expect it to shift right there all of a sudden, like, "Oh, I'm so sorry that that turned on." Normally, there has to be like a, "Let's power down," right? So, as an officer, once you realize it, take 5, take a breath. Just like I said, my husband just walks off, takes breath, he comes back, and let your spouse or your family know that you need that moment to calm down. Part of the communication between my husband and I, it's like, it's fine if he just walks off, but if I'm in a situation and he's feeling out of control or anxious and he just walks off, I might misinterpret what that behavior is. So you might just need to say, or like, put your hand up with 5 minutes, or whatever you need to do to indicate that you need to turn that off. You realize it's coming on, but you've got to communicate. That's what you're going to do, is that you're going to go calm down. Then try to communicate the feeling that you're experiencing. So are you feeling out of control? Are you feeling anxious? Whatever's going on there. This sometimes can be really challenging because it takes a minute for the brain to be able to shift, right? You can't go from this command presence and then shift to say, like, I'm feeling anxious. So it might sound more like, okay, brace the volume here. It might sound more like, I'm feeling anxious, or I'm out of control, right? So it might be more of an elevated level. Maybe you're not yelling, but maybe there is a, I'm just anxious. I'm just anxious. And it sounds really intense. The more you say how you're feeling, the brain does this weird thing and your prefrontal cortex kicks on and goes, "Oh, we need to solve a problem." Just saying how you're feeling over and over again, like, this is driving me crazy. These people are bananas. This traffic is really frustrating me. Whatever it is, it's okay to talk about it as long as you know that you can't control them. You can only control you. So if you're in the car driving and it kicks in, sorry, I'm laughing because this happens, right? It kicks in and I see my husband and he'll comment on somebody like, "Stay there." He'll say that sometimes, "Stay there." And I'm like, "Oh, you really wish that you could jump out and direct traffic right now." He's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "But you can't. All you can do is control you, right? You just got to be a good driver." He's like, "Yeah, yeah, I know." So it's funny how as a spouse you can help with that, but you have to recognize it. And as an officer, once again, I said this phrase last time too in the last podcast, you have to accept the influence. So if your family or spouse is saying, "Hey, this is kicking in," listen, help them to help you to move through that situation. It's also worth a note, like, authoritarian spillover doesn't necessarily just show up as behavior. It also can just be as simple as wanting to fix problems instead of listening, because that's what officers and first responders do, is they just fix everybody else's problems, right? It's an easy fix as a couple to work on that. And you can say little things in conversation like, "I need you to listen and not solve this." Or you, as an officer, you can say, "Do you need me to listen, or do you need me to help solve this or offer advice?" The other thing, you can also ask the question, like, "How can I support you right now? What do you need from me?" And when you do that, it shows empathy and it opens the door for more connection. So it's like the antithesis of the authoritarian spillover, which can cause some disconnection. If you catch yourself slipping into command presence at home, like I said, just pause, reframe, take a breath. But I love this part. Ask yourself, am I acting as a protector or a partner? Sometimes as a partner, I want to be protected, but a lot of times I don't need to be protected. I need a partner. In your relationship, are you wanting to be a partner, or are you sliding into that protector role? Just think about that. Little small changes can lead to some big improvements in this area. For example, replacing directives with collaborative phrases like, "What do you think we should do?" Or, "Let's figure this out together." So instead of saying, "Do this," maybe saying, "Hey, I'm thinking this, but what do you think? You're incorporating that team in there. When spouses can gently point out when the officer is slipping into that work mode and use shared language to navigate those moments, there's more understanding and less blame or frustration. Once again, we have another training that keeps officers safe on the job that spills over at home. When we as a couple are aware of these aspects, we can avoid conflict and have more connection and safety in our relationships. There are a lot of different ways that I think training hurts our relationships at home. It helps our police officers greatly. It keeps them coming home, but it spills over because it's training and it's ingrained into their brain and it's wiring. If you want more detail on authoritarian spillover or other ways to improve your law enforcement relationship, check out my book, Hold the Line, The Essential Guide to Protecting Your Law Enforcement Relationship. The link is in the show notes below, or you can grab that book at any online retailer that you might buy your books at. So if you found this episode helpful and informative, the best way you can pay me back is to pay it forward. Share this with another officer, your department wellness team, or another law enforcement spouse. That would be great. The more people that know about this resource and that learn how to impact their relationship, the safer our officers are going to be. Thanks for joining me this week. And until next time, y'all, keep it Code 4. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us. For more information about the podcast or Cindy, check out code4couples.com. All intellectual property rights owned by CRLD2 Ventures, LLC, are protected by the firm of 9mm, 45 ACP, 5.56mm, and 12 gauge.